The cold settled into their bones, a constant, brittle presence. It was the winter of 2015, and Minnesota had cloaked itself in a fierce, unforgiving silence. The snow fell in soft, dense flakes, blanketing the world in a deceptive purity. Beneath that pristine white, a quiet, domestic drama was beginning to unfold. The house, I am a witness, a silent observer of the lives that pass through me. I stand on a quiet street in Apple Valley, my brick facade a bastion against the biting wind. They called me home, though for a time, I was an empty vessel, a shell waiting to be filled. I watched them arrive in December of 2015, a small family with a U-Haul truck and a fragile hope. There was a man named Martin, his face etched with a cautious optimism. A woman, Tony, her eyes full of a fierce, possessive joy, and her son, a quiet boy named Gavin, who moved with the tentative grace of a sapling. They came to me as a unit, a family unit, or so I was led to believe. They spoke of a new beginning, of laying down roots, of our house. I absorbed their plans, their whispered dreams, the way my wooden floors absorbed the scuffs of their new shoes. They filled my rooms with furniture, laughter, and the scent of pot roast. The Christmas tree they set up in the living room was a monument to their shared future. They were, in those early days, a symphony of domestic bliss. But I knew, in the way old houses know things, that the harmony was a fragile one. The foundation of their joint ownership was not built of bricks and mortar, but of whispered promises and unspoken assumptions. The deed, I knew, was in one name only: Martin's, Tony's perspective. We did it. We actually did it. Standing in the living room looking out at the endless expanse of snow, I felt a surge of triumph. This was ours. Martin and I had worked for this. The down payment, the closing costs, we had scraped and saved and combined our resources. I remember the day we signed the papers, the heavy weight of the manila folders in my hands. The notary had a kind smile, and she spoke in hushed, professional tones. Martin had handled most of it, his name on the documents. It made sense. He had better credit, a more stable income. We were a team. I trusted him. He was the protector, the provider. It was a partnership, a collaboration. My name on the deed seemed like a mere formality, a detail. Who cares about a name when you're building a life together? We were a we. This house was the tangible symbol of that we. I had left a life in Illinois for this, for him, for us. My son Gavin had been apprehensive, but he was starting to settle in. We went sledding in the park, our laughter echoing off the cold air. The first snowstorm felt magical. We were a real family, a real home. The old house breathed with a kind of quiet contentment, but a few months in, the cracks began to show. The little arguments became bigger, more frequent. The whispers of love turned into shouts of frustration. The things that had seemed so minor, his work schedule, my parenting style, now felt like insurmountable obstacles. He started staying out later. I started to feel a creeping sense of panic, the ground beneath me shifting. This wasn't the life we had planned. It wasn't the home we had built. It wasn't our home anymore. It was his. The silent, terrifying realization started to take hold. I was a guest here. I was a guest in a house I had helped build, a guest in a life I had helped create. I felt like a stranger, an intruder. Fear, hot and sharp, began to consume me. What if he left? What if he kicked me out? What if this perfect, pristine world of ours crumbled and I was left with nothing? This house, this beautiful, sprawling house, was all I had. It was my only anchor in a storm of uncertainty. I had to protect it. I had to protect myself. He came home one night after an argument, the air between us thick with unspoken resentments. He tried to talk, to reason, but I couldn't hear him. I saw only the threat, the possibility of losing everything. It was a primal fear. My mind, fueled by sleepless nights and mounting anxiety, started to build a fortress. I needed a weapon, a shield. I needed to establish my right to be here, my right to this house. I went to the courthouse. The air was sterile and cold, a stark contrast to the warmth of my home. The paperwork was a blur of legal jargon, but the message was clear: a restraining order. It was a word I had only heard in movies, in a world that wasn't my own. But it was mine now. I checked the boxes. Assault. I told them he had assaulted me. There were no bruises, no broken bones, but the assault was real to me. The emotional assault, the fear. I needed them to see it. I needed them to believe me. The sheriff's car pulled up to the house a few hours later, its lights a silent, flashing commentary on our shattered life. I watched from the window as they spoke to Martin, their forms silhouetted against the streetlights. The finality of it all was overwhelming. I was safe. I was protected. I was here to stay, Martin's perspective. I remember the day we looked at the house. The air was frigid, the ground covered in a fresh layer of snow. Tony loved it immediately. She saw the potential, the life we could build here. I saw the numbers, the mortgage, the taxes, the repairs. It was a big commitment, a financial leap of faith. But I was in love, and for a time, I was willing to do anything. The deed was in my name. It had to be. My credit was good. My income was steady. I had saved for years for a down payment. I worked 2 jobs to make it happen. Tony had contributed what she could, but it was a fraction of the total. It was my house, my responsibility. My name on the papers was a fact, a simple, non-negotiable reality. We were a couple and couples share, but this was my share of the sharing. The first few months were a dream. We were a family. Gavin was a great kid. I taught him how to shovel snow, how to build a fire. We played video games in the basement, the sound of our laughter bouncing off the concrete walls. We were a family, and this house was our sanctuary. Then slowly the sanctuary became a cage. The arguments started. Small things at first. The way she left the dishes in the sink. The way I left my tools on the floor. But they grew. They festered. The loving glances turned into suspicious stares. The quiet conversations turned into shouting matches. I tried to talk to her, to understand what was happening. She was withdrawn, distant, her eyes full of a fear I couldn't comprehend. The night the police came, I was in the garage fixing a leaky faucet. I had just come in ready to apologize, to try and fix whatever was broken between us. The knock on the door was jarring, a sharp report in the quiet night. I opened it to see 2 sheriff's deputies, their faces grim. "Martin Gustafson?" one of them asked. "Yes. We have a protective order against you. You need to leave the premises immediately." The words hit me like a physical blow. A protective order? I looked past them into the living room and saw Tony standing there, her face unreadable. I looked at the deputies, bewildered. What? What are you talking about? This is my house." "The order states you are to be excluded from the residence," the deputy said, his voice flat and unemotional. "You need to gather your things and leave." I stood there frozen. Leave? Leave my home? The house I had built, the mortgage I paid, the taxes I would pay for the rest of my life. My house, the one with my name on the deed. I felt the floor crumble beneath me. The world spun into a sickening blur. This was a nightmare, a horrible, cruel nightmare. I was escorted from my own home, my own life. I packed a small bag, my hands shaking. I looked at Tony, trying to understand, but she just stared back, her face a mask of cold detachment. I looked at Gavin, who was watching from the top of the stairs, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. I was a stranger in my own house. I was an intruder. The world had turned upside down. I found a place to stay, a small apartment a few miles away. The silence was deafening. I was a ghost, a specter haunting the life I had built. Every month the bills came, the mortgage payment, the property taxes. I paid them. I had to. It was my house. I was responsible for it. Even though I wasn't allowed inside. I paid for the walls, the roof, the heat that kept her and her son warm while I slept in a barren room. My life in a suitcase. 10 months passed like this. 10 months of paying for a home I wasn't allowed to enter. 10 months of phone calls to lawyers, of navigating a confusing and cruel court system. 10 months of watching the snow fall on a house that was mine, but wasn't. The world outside looked the same. The Minnesota winter was still as cold and unforgiving as ever. But my world had been irrevocably changed. I was on the outside looking in, a spectator to my own life. My house, my life had been stolen from me, and I was paying for the privilege. The fluorescent lights of the courtroom were a harsh, unforgiving white, a stark contrast to the soft glow of the lamps in the house Martin was no longer allowed to enter. 10 months had passed since he was ordered to leave, 10 long months of a life lived in exile. The air in the courtroom was thick with the scent of old paper and nervous sweat, a tangible representation of the cold, clinical reality that had replaced the warmth of his home. Martin sat on one side of the room, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his knuckles white. The union carpenter's hands, calloused and strong from years of building, now felt useless, powerless. He looked across the aisle at Tony. She was dressed in a simple dark sweater, her face a carefully constructed mask of composure. He remembered those sweaters, the way they would catch the light from the fireplace, the way she would curl up in one on a cold winter night. That was then. This was now. He had spent nearly a year fighting to get back into his own house, his own life. The process was a grinding, soul-crushing one. Each phone call with his lawyer, each email, each document he had to sign felt like another nail in the coffin of his former life. He was paying for this too, paying to fight for something that was, by all rights, already his. Martin's inner monologue. I built this, not just the house, but my life. I've worked since I was a teenager, on construction sites, in garages, anywhere I could get my hands dirty and earn an honest wage. I'm a union carpenter. That's not just a job, it's a living. A good one. I was proud of it. I was proud of being able to provide. When we decided to buy a house, it wasn't an impulsive decision. It was the culmination of years of hard work. My money, my credit, my name. I was the rock. I was the foundation. And now, look, she's living in my house with my heat, my hot water, using my money, and I'm out here fighting for the right to go home. It's a joke. It's an injustice. But Judge Judy, she gets it. I can see it in her eyes. She's looking at the facts, not the emotions. And the facts are on my side. Tony, meanwhile, sat with her back straight, her gaze fixed on the judge. She felt the weight of Martin's silent accusation, a pressure that was both familiar and exhausting. She had spent the last 10 months in a state of high alert, constantly expecting the other shoe to drop. She had to be strong for herself and for Gavin. This was about survival. Tony's inner monologue. He thinks it's all about money, all about the numbers. But it's not. It's about more than that. It's about what we built together. We were a couple. We were a team. It's not fair that his income is so much bigger. It's not fair that he gets to be the one who gets a union job while I have to hustle day and night just to make ends meet. He was the one who was never home. He was the one who made me feel unsafe. The restraining order wasn't a power play. It was a lifeline. It was a way to protect my son and me from a situation that was spiraling out of control. It wasn't a choice. It was a necessity. I needed to do what I had to do. He can look at me all he wants. He can feel angry, but he wasn't the one who was scared. And if he was really a partner, if we really were a we, then the money wouldn't matter. We would be sharing the burdens, not just the benefits. Judge Judy's voice cut through the tense silence like a razor blade. She had no time for pretense, no patience for sob stories. She dealt in facts, and the facts she knew were often at odds with the feelings. Ms. Meadows, you were living in the home with Mr. Gustafson for about 2 months before you filed for a protective order. What kind of work were you doing at that time? Tony's voice was small but steady. At that time, I was a hairdresser, and I had my own business with my leatherworks. Did you file tax returns in 2016? The judge continued. Yes, I did. How much did you claim that you earned in 2016? $20,000, Tony replied. The number felt small and insignificant in the large echoing courtroom. It was a number that represented a life of scraping by, of making do with what she had. A number that didn't feel like a fair comparison to his. Judge Judy turned her attention to Martin. And what kind of work do you do, sir? I'm a union carpenter, Martin said, his voice stronger and fused with a hint of pride. And how much did you claim that you earned in 2016? I believe it was $72,000. A silence fell over the room as the numbers hung in the air, a stark, undeniable contrast. Judge Judy's gaze was piercing, moving between the two of them. She didn't need a calculator. The math was simple. So clearly you were the support of the household. Yes, Martin said. It was a single word, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unpaid bills and lonely nights. It was a word of vindication. The judge picked up a stack of documents from her desk. Her fingers were quick and precise as she shuffled through them. The purchase price of the home was what? $206,000, Martin responded. How much of a down payment was put down on this house? 1,000. A subtle arch of the judge's eyebrow was the only hint of her reaction. Whose name was on the mortgage? His name was Alone. Correct. The judge laid the documents on her desk, the sound of the papers hitting the wood a final definitive period on that line of questioning. She didn't need to ask who had been paying it. It was a foregone conclusion. The file inserts, meticulously compiled by Martin's lawyer, told the rest of the story. File insert 1, mortgage statement, mortgagee, Martin Gustafson, property, 1234, Applebluff Valley Drive, Applebluff Valley, MN 55124, monthly payment, $1,300. Note, this statement reflects payments made since February 2016. File insert 2, property tax bill. Owner of record, Martin Gustafson, property, 1234, Apple Valley Drive, Apple Valley, MN 55124, tax due, $2,850, semi-annual. Note, payment confirmed via bank transfer on March 15, 2016. File insert 3, Bank of America statement, March 2016. Transaction date, 03/01/2016. Description, mortgage payment, loan, amount, $1,300. Transaction on 03/15/2016. Description, County of Dakota property. Tax amount of $2,850. File insert 4, attorney invoice, March 2016. Client, Martin Gustafson, invoice number 01/2016. Description, retainer for property, dispute and protective order case amount, due $5,000. The judge looked over her glasses at Tony, her expression unreadable. You were living in a home you helped pay for with your limited income, and you were not paying the mortgage or the taxes, correct? Tony hesitated for a moment. She knew the answer. She knew it was the truth. It was a survival truth, a desperate truth, but a truth all the same. Yes. The judge's voice was as cold and sharp as the Minnesota wind. How long was he out of the house? Starting in February 2016, and you and your kid were living in the house, not paying the mortgage, not paying the taxes, and he was. Tony's composure finally broke. The single, raw number was all she could offer. 10 months, Your Honor. The words were a quiet, defeated surrender. Martin's jaw was tight, but he said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence spoke volumes. The judge had laid bare the simple, stark reality of the situation. He was the one who had provided, and for 10 months he had done so from the outside looking in. The legal system, for all its grand halls and marble columns, often feels less like a majestic institution and more like a waiting room for the exhausted. For 10 months, Martin and Tony had been trapped in its sterile purgatory, their lives on hold, their futures dependent on paper filings, court dates, and the whims of lawyers. The initial fire of their conflict had been replaced by a weary, grinding fatigue. Martin, exiled from his home, was losing a battle of attrition. Tony, living in his house, felt a different kind of pressure, the constant, low-level anxiety of a borrowed existence. The house, meanwhile, stood still, a silent stage for a drama of human frailty. The house I have seen the seasons turn since they arrived, the deep freeze of winter, the tentative thaw of spring, the lush growth of summer, and now the sharp, final chill of a new autumn. I have watched them from my windows, a silent observer of a life that was never meant to be. The man, Martin, a ghost haunting the streets he once called home, driving by slowly, sometimes late at night, his eyes fixed on my lit windows, his face a mask of bitter resentment. The woman, Tony, and her son, living inside, their laughter now hollow, their movements burdened by the weight of a quiet, constant conflict. I know this is not a home built on love anymore. It is a fortress built on a legal document, a protective order that keeps one person in and another person out. The mail that came to my mailbox told a story of a different kind of war. It was full of bills, invoices, and legal notices, addressed only to Martin. For 10 months, I absorbed the cold facts of his financial commitment, the mortgage, the taxes, the rising cost of a legal battle that seemed to have no end. I was a house, but I was also an asset, and now I was a liability, a drain on a man who was no longer allowed to live in my walls. And then a change came, not with a bang, but with a series of quiet, buzzing notifications. Tony's inner monologue. I had to win. I couldn't lose. He had all the power, all the money, all the control. I couldn't let him take this house from me, from us. This wasn't just a house, it was stability. It was security. It was a new beginning. I'd wake up every morning and look at the sunrise over the frozen lake, and I'd know that this was mine. This was my hard-won peace, but the peace was always so fragile. Every knock at the door, every phone call, every piece of mail felt like a threat. And the money was always in the background, a silent, terrifying accusation. I was living here for free, and he was out there paying for it. It was a truth I had to bury deep down, a debt I couldn't afford to acknowledge. I told myself it was fair. I was the one who had been wronged. I was the one who was scared. It was only right that he should pay for his actions. But even with all my justifications, the feeling of dread never fully went away. I was running on fumes emotionally and financially. The first text message came one dreary Thursday afternoon in December. The legal battle had been a part of her life for so long that it felt like a permanent fixture. She saw the number and her heart began to pound. It was Martin, a number she hadn't seen on her screen in months. She took a deep breath and opened it. File insert 1, text message, exchange, December 2016. Martin, my lawyer just quit. Tony, what? Martin, he said he can't take it anymore. He's done. You won. Tony, I won? Martin, you outlasted me. I can't afford this anymore. I'm done. The house is yours. Do what you want with it. I want to be done with this. Just pay me what I put into it. The down payment. Tony, I don't have that kind of money, but I can buy it from you. I'll get a mortgage in my own name. Martin, how? On $20K a year? Are you serious? Tony, it's my house. We bought it together. I have a right to it. Tony's hands were shaking as she read the messages. A surge of triumph, pure and unadulterated, washed over her. She had won. She had outlasted him. The nightmare was over. The house, her sanctuary, was hers. She sat on the couch, the very couch he had helped her move in, and felt a quiet, powerful sense of vindication. She didn't have to live in fear anymore. She could get a mortgage. She could find a way. The fantasy was powerful, a siren, a song of hope. She started to make calls, to talk to banks, to look online at mortgage calculators. The numbers she saw were staggering. The monthly payment on a $206,000 home, even with a small down payment, was far more than she could ever hope to afford on her $20,000 annual income. The reality began to creep in, a dark shadow over her triumphant moment. But she pushed it away. She was in a new legal battle, but this time she was fighting for herself, for her family, and this time she was winning. File insert 2, lawyer's withdrawal notice to Mr. Martin Gustafson from the law offices of law firm name. Subject, withdrawal of representation. Dear Mr. Gustafson, due to unforeseen circumstances and a mutual agreement regarding the costs of continued litigation, this letter serves as a formal notice of our withdrawal as your legal counsel in the case of Meadows versus Gustafson, effective immediately. We wish you the best in the future. Sincerely, lawyer's name, Martin's inner monologue. I was done. I couldn't do it anymore. My bank account was a wasteland. The legal fees had piled up like a mountain of snow in a Minnesota winter, and I was buried under it. My lawyer looked at me with a kind of pity and said, "We've done all we can, Martin, but this is a battle of who can last longer. You're losing." He was right. I had a good job, a good income, but this had drained me. And for what? For a house I couldn't live in? For a life that was now a ghost story? I sent her the text. You won. The words felt like a confession, a surrender, but a part of me felt a kind of freedom. The pressure was off. The fight was over. But then her reply came. I want to buy the house. I laughed out loud, a bitter, hollow laugh that echoed in the empty apartment I had been calling home. Was she serious? Did she actually believe a bank would give her a mortgage on her income? It was insane. It was pure fantasy, but I knew in that moment that the battle wasn't over. It had just moved to a different front. Back in the courtroom, Judge Judy, with her sharp, analytical mind, was cutting through the emotional drama and getting to the heart of the matter. She listened as Tony recounted the text messages, her voice full of a triumphant confidence. So now, 10 months later, something happens, Judge Judy said, her voice a low rumble. You want to tell me what happened? Sure, Tony said, her face alight with what she thought was victory. 10 months later, he starts calling and says, my lawyer quit. You won. I have it all in text messages. Right, the judge said, a flicker of a smile on her face. My lawyer quit. You outlasted him. The words were an acknowledgement, but also a quiet condemnation. This wasn't a win based on merit, but on endurance. The judge looked over the documents that Tony's lawyer had presented. It was a new motion, a request for the court to force Martin to sell the home to Tony for the amount of his down payment. A simple, elegant solution, Tony thought. The judge's gaze was fixed on a financial statement, her expression giving nothing away. Okay, the judge said, leaning back in her chair. And you were prepared to pay him that and get another mortgage on your $20,000 a year income, she said, her voice dripping with a sarcasm that was as biting as the Minnesota wind. And there are 1,000 banks after 2008 who are going to give you a mortgage on a $206,000 house on $20,000 worth of income. They're lining up. The words hung in the air, a final, unassailable truth. The hope, the victory, the belief in her own plan, all of it deflated like a pop balloon. Tony's composure broke, her face a mask of shocked, silent defeat. The fantasy was over. The money, which she had so desperately tried to ignore, was now front and center, an immovable obstacle that stood between her and the house she believed was hers. The fight, it seemed, was far from over. This is where part 3 ends, with Tony's triumphant feeling of victory being swiftly undercut by Judge Judy's dose of financial reality. Let me know if you would like me to proceed with part 4. The Minnesota winter of 2017 was a different kind of cold. It wasn't just the air, it was a cold that had settled into the very fabric of their lives. After 10 months of a bitter, exhausting legal war, a fragile truce had been called. Martin, defeated by financial strain, and Tony, a victor with no way to claim her prize, had found themselves at an impasse. It was a stalemate born of exhaustion, and in the space it created, a flicker of something that resembled hope began to stir the house. I am the repository of their history, a silent keeper of their secrets. I watched them circle each other in the early months of 2017. The protective order was still in place, but Martin would call, and Tony, emboldened by what she saw as her victory, would answer. The conversations were tentative at first, then longer, filled with a cautious hope. They talked about the past, about the future, about how a life they once dreamed of had been twisted into something unrecognizable. The air between them, once so thick with resentment, seemed to thin, allowing for a fragile connection to reemerge. I saw the change when Martin started coming back. He'd sit in his truck, the engine running, a phantom in the driveway, and Tony would come out and sit with him. I felt the unspoken words, the shared grief for what they had lost. Then, one day, she invited him inside. The protective order was a piece of paper, a legal fiction that had no power over the complicated, contradictory emotions that still bound them together. For a few short weeks, my rooms were filled with a strange, hesitant peace. The tension was still there, a thin wire stretched taut, but they were together. They slept in the same bed, ate at the same table. It was a new beginning, a second chance. The reconciliation, however, was as fleeting as a snowflake on a warm windowsill. It wasn't built on a foundation of trust or forgiveness, but on the shifting sands of convenience and a shared, desperate need for what was lost. The old arguments returned, sharper and more vicious than before. The arguments weren't about bills or lawyers now. They were about the betrayal itself. The emotional toll of the past year had left them both raw and exposed. The drinks came out at night, the wine bottles, the whiskey. The arguments grew louder, the words more cruel. I could feel the trust crumbling, a slow, inevitable decay. I had witnessed their love die a year ago, and now I was witnessing its ghost tear itself apart. Tony's inner monologue. When he texted you won, I felt a rush of vindication. But then the reality set in. I was alone in this house with a debt I couldn't afford. When he started calling, a part of me, a small, hopeful part, saw a way out, a way to have both the house and the life I had lost. I dropped the restraining order on February 16th, 2017. It was a sign of good faith, a peace offering. I thought we could go back, that we could forget the past and build a new future. But he hadn't changed. The old tensions were still there, just beneath the surface. He would get angry and he would drink, and the fear would start all over again. I had to protect myself. I had to protect my son. On March 10th, 2017, it all came to a head. He was yelling, his face red, his words like daggers. I tried to get away, to go upstairs to Gavin. He grabbed me. He had me in a headlock. I lost my footing. I fell. I tumbled down the stairs. The pain was instant, a hot, searing agony. My body was bruised, but my pride was what was broken. I felt a surge of rage. He had done it again, and this time I was going to make sure the law was on my side. Tony called 911, then she called again. Then she called a third time. The police came, their presence a silent, flashing commentary on the failure of their reconciliation. File insert 1, police notes summary, March 10th, 2017. Call 1-2230. Caller Tony Meadows alleges a domestic dispute, verbal altercation with male subject, Martin Gustafson. Police respond, mediate, no physical contact alleged. Parties separated for the evening. No formal report filed. Call 2-2315. Caller, Tony Meadows, alleges male subject, Martin Gustafson, is refusing to leave. Police respond. Mr. Gustafson states he has a right to be in the home. No evidence of physical altercation. Advise both parties on legal options. No arrests made. Call 3-30. Caller, Tony Meadows, alleges physical assault, stating she was thrown down the stairs. Male subject denies all allegations. Officer notes no visible injuries on Ms. Meadows. Both parties are emotionally distraught. Ms. Meadows requests an emergency protective order. Police file a report for domestic dispute. No arrest made. Martin's inner monologue. I came back to the house because I missed it. I missed her, and I missed my life. I was a fool to think it could work. We were both so broken from what happened. Every conversation was a minefield, every word a potential weapon. I was tired of being accused of things I hadn't done, tired of being the bad guy. On March 10th, she was drinking, and the anger came back, the accusations. I told her to just go to bed. I put my hands on her shoulders just to guide her away from me, to get some space. She tripped. She stumbled. She fell. It wasn't me, it was an accident. And just like that, the peace was gone. The police came back. The same police, the same questions. But this time she said I had thrown her down the stairs. The lie was so audacious, so casual that it took my breath away. And the worst part, she was back in the courtroom trying to get another restraining order. The nightmare had started all over again. Judge Judy's gaze was fixed on Tony, her expression a mixture of skepticism and quiet impatience. She had seen this story before too many times. She had the documents in front of her. The withdrawal of the first protective order, the police reports from the night of the incident. I absolutely know that there are 2 restraining orders, Judge Judy said, her voice a low, clear rumble. Now at some point, he came back to the house. The date was March 10th, 2017. Now what had precipitated that? Had you been having discussions about the sale of the house? Tony's voice was shaky, but she held her ground. We had tried to, and then he had me drop the restraining order, which I did. It was right after Christmas in January. The judge nodded, confirming the dates. So now he's filed your case where you said, I don't need a restraining order anymore. And then what happened? Like I said, he started getting what I call weird, okay? He would come over. I called the police. 3 separate times I called 911. The judge's gaze was sharp, unblinking. She was a master at cutting through the noise, at getting to the core of a person's motives. That's what you said in February 2016. Tony flinched at the comparison, but she pressed on, her voice rising in a desperate attempt to be heard. Your Honor, he had me in a headlock, throwing me down the stairs. The judge leaned forward, her voice dropping to a low, authoritative murmur. Assault means an injury. She looked at her notes, at the police report that stated no visible injuries. If somebody threw me down a flight of stairs, she said, her voice now a powerful and unassailable statement, I would go see a doctor. The words were a quiet, final verdict. There was no evidence, no medical records, just her word against his. And in a court of law, that wasn't enough. The case, like the hope for their reconciliation, was crumbling, turning to dust. The courtroom was a crucible, burning away pretense to reveal the hard truth of facts and figures. Tony's case had been a series of emotional pleas, of what she believed to be her truth. But Judge Judy dealt in a different currency. She dealt in evidence. And in a world of police reports with no mention of injuries and emotional turmoil that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet, there was no case. The gavel had fallen on her claims, and now it was Martin's turn to speak. The house I have seen countless lives pass through my rooms, but this was a new kind of tragedy. The final act was not a crescendo of passion, but a quiet, bitter accounting. Martin's lawyer, having been replaced by Martin himself, a man armed only with a stack of bills and a simmering resentment, stood before the court. The atmosphere was no longer about a restraining order or a relationship. It was about damage, about loss, about the bone, hard cost of a year of exile. I knew the truth of what he was saying. The broken windows, the graffiti on my walls, the utilities that went unpaid. They were all signs of a home that had been neglected, of a promise that had been shattered. I was no longer a home. I was a legal exhibit, a pile of damage to be quantified and repaid, Martin's inner monologue. I was exhausted. This wasn't a win. It was just the end of a long, miserable war. The past year had stripped me of my home, my relationship, and my savings. All I had left was the cold, hard fact of my name on the deed, my signature on the mortgage papers, and this stack of receipts. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the principle. The windows were broken. Her son's friends, she had to admit that. The graffiti in the garage, a childish, cruel scrawl that had no place in my home. She hadn't paid a single utility bill since I left. For 10 months I had been paying for her and her son to live in a house they had damaged, a life they had taken from me. I was tired of being the villain in her story. I was just a man who wanted his life back. I wanted the money back, yes, but more than that, I just wanted it to be over. I just wanted to go home, even if it was just to pick up the pieces of what was left. Judge Judy's voice was decisive, a final verdict in a long, drawn-out case. I'm dismissing your case, she said, looking directly at Tony. Now I'm going to entertain his case. The shift in the room was palpable. The energy had changed. The court's attention, which had been on Tony and her emotional claims, was now on Martin and his practical, undeniable losses. What was vandalized? The judge asked, her gaze fixed on Martin's file. 2 windows were broken, Martin said, his voice flat, emotionless. Screens were broken, graffiti on the walls in the garage. He held up a few pictures, the evidence undeniable. A shattered pane of glass, a crude, spray-painted drawing on the drywall. Judge Judy looked over at Tony, her eyes narrowing. How'd the graffiti get on the walls, Miss Meadows? Tony hesitated, her face flushed with a mixture of shame and anger. My son's friends. The words were a quiet, defeated admission. And the window broken? The judge continued. I have no idea, Tony said, a desperate lie to a woman who could see right through it. The judge shuffled the papers on her desk, her gaze now moving between Tony's financial statements and Martin's list of damages. The two-dimensional world of a courtroom, where every action had to be documented, was finally making sense. You had a whole lot from the $20,000 a year that you earned, Judge Judy said, her voice dry and sarcastic, a final biting commentary on Tony's grand plan. Tony's composure finally, completely broke. The frustration, the exhaustion, the grief of the past year all came flooding out. I'm 51 years old. Everything I've saved all my life was in that house. The words were a plea, a cry for understanding. And he's kept everything. I can't start over. Terrific, the judge said, a single cutting word that dismissed her entire argument. She was not there to grant second chances. She was there to apply the law. The law, she knew, was a cold and unfeeling thing. It was concerned with deeds and payments, not with hopes and dreams. Judgment on the counterclaim for $3,500, she said, her voice loud, clear, and final. Your claim is dismissed. Final reflection. The gavel fell with a thud, a sound that echoed through the silent courtroom, and a final definitive period on a story that was a year in the making. Toni had lost her case, her claim to the house, and her last hope of a new beginning. Martin had won, but the victory felt hollow, a small sum of money to compensate for a year of loss. The law, in its cold, unfeeling way, had settled the matter. It didn't care about who loved whom, or who felt betrayed, or who felt frightened. It cared about documents, about deeds, about bank statements. It valued the simple, factual reality of a name on a piece of paper and the money that flowed from one account to another. It was a harsh lesson in a world that often prizes emotions over logic. So the story ends not with a victory or a defeat, but with a question that hangs in the air, a question that has no easy answer. Is it harder to own a house or to lose a family? Conclusion. This narrative has followed the tumultuous journey of Toni and Martin, from a shared dream to a bitter legal battle. The story concludes with Judge Judy's final, decisive judgment, which values the tangible evidence of deeds and payments over the emotional claims of a fractured relationship. The house, which began as a symbol of their fragile hope, becomes a monument to their mutual loss. I hope you enjoyed this 5-part narrative. If you'd like to explore any other topics or continue the story in a new way, just let me know.